For most of the 20th century, there was one story that every textbook, every museum exhibit, and every school lesson told about how humans first arrived in the Americas. It was clean, it was tidy, and, as it turns out, it was almost certainly wrong. According to that old story, a group of big-game hunters walked across a frozen land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska sometime. Around 13,000 years ago, they followed herds of mammoths and other massive Ice Age animals through a narrow gap in the ice sheets, and within a few generations, their descendants had spread across 2 entire continents, from the Arctic Circle all the way down to the southern tip of Chile. This idea became so widely accepted, so deeply embedded in scientific consensus, that it earned its own name. Researchers called it the Clovis first model, named after a distinctive style of stone spearpoint first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. For decades, Clovis first was not just a theory, it was treated almost as settled fact. Any archaeological site that claimed to be older than 13,000 years was met with deep skepticism and often outright dismissal from the broader scientific community. Careers were built defending this timeline. Careers were also quietly ended for challenging it. And then, over the past 2 decades, something remarkable happened. Ancient DNA, recovered from bones, teeth, and even fossilized footprints preserved in ancient mud, began telling a very different story. A story that scientists are still piecing together today. A story that suggests the peopling of the Americas was not one single simple migration at all, but something far older, far more complex, and far more remarkable than anyone had previously dared to imagine. Let's start with where the cracks in the old story first began to appear, because understanding how a scientific consensus unravels is just as fascinating as the discovery itself. Long before ancient DNA entered the picture, archaeologists working at a site called Monteverde in southern Chile uncovered something that should not have existed according to the Clovis first model. They found stone tools, remnants of animal hides, and even preserved plant material, all dating to roughly 14,500 years ago. This was earlier than Clovis, and Monteverde sits in southern Chile, thousands of miles from the Bering land bridge, at the opposite end of 2 entire continents. If the Clovis first model were correct, this simply should not be possible. There was no plausible way for hunters to cross the land bridge, travel the length of North America, cross into South America, and settle as far south as Chile, all within just a few hundred years of the supposed original migration. For years, mainstream researchers pushed back hard against these findings. Some suggested contamination. Others questioned the dating methods entirely. It took more than a decade of painstaking, repeated verification before Monteverde was finally, grudgingly, accepted by the broader scientific community as genuine evidence of a pre-Clovis human presence in the Americas. Then, in 2021, an even more startling discovery emerged, this time from White Sands National Park in New Mexico. Researchers uncovered a series of fossilized human footprints preserved in ancient lakebed sediment. Using radiocarbon dating on seeds embedded directly within the footprint layers, scientists determined these tracks were left somewhere between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. That is, nearly 10,000 years before Clovis. 10,000 years before humans were supposedly even capable of reaching that far south, according to the old model. Picture that timeline for a moment. These footprints were made during the height of the last ice age, when massive continental ice sheets still covered much of North America, supposedly blocking any possible route south. And yet, here was direct physical evidence that people, likely families, based on the mix of adult and children's footprints found. Together, were already walking across what is now New Mexico, thousands of years before the migration was supposed to have even begun. This is exactly the kind of moment that makes science genuinely exciting rather than simply comfortable. 1,000 years was enough to force the entire field to reconsider decades of accepted consensus. But footprints and stone tools, while compelling, can only tell researchers so much. Where their ancestors came from, and how they were related to one another, and to the millions of indigenous peoples living across the Americas today. For that deeper layer of understanding, scientists needed something footprints alone could never provide. They needed ancient DNA. The genetic revolution in understanding the peopling of the Americas truly began to accelerate around 2014, when an international team of researchers successfully sequenced the genome of an infant boy who had died and been buried in what is now Montana, roughly 12,600 years ago. This child, whom researchers respectfully refer to as Anzic I, named after the family who owns the land where he was discovered, was buried alongside more than 100 Clovis-style stone and bone tools. He remains, to this day, one of the oldest and most complete ancient human genomes ever recovered from the Americas. What researchers found within his DNA was genuinely extraordinary. Anzic I's genetic profile showed clear, direct ancestral connections to indigenous peoples living across Central and South America today. In other words, this was not simply an ancient stranger. He was a direct genetic relative, an ancestor in the truest sense, of millions of indigenous people who continue to live across 2 entire continents in the present day. This single genome helped confirm something researchers had long suspected but had never been able to prove so conclusively: that the deep ancestry of indigenous Americans traces back to a shared founding population, one that likely originated somewhere in ancient Siberia. But here's where the story becomes significantly more complicated and considerably more interesting. If humans supposedly crossed from Siberia into the Americas around 13,000 years ago, why did white sands show clear evidence of human presence 8 to 10,000 years earlier than that? Ancient DNA research has since offered scientists a genuinely compelling answer to that exact puzzle. Genetic studies comparing ancient Siberian populations to early Native American genomes revealed something researchers now call the Beringian standstill hypothesis. According to this model, the ancestors of Native Americans did not simply walk directly across the land bridge and continue onward into the Americas in one continuous journey. Instead, genetic evidence suggests this founding population became geographically isolated somewhere within Beringia. The vast landmass that once connected Siberia and Alaska before rising sea levels submerged it for a remarkably long stretch of time. Some genetic estimates place this period of isolation at somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 years before this population ever continued onward into the Americas proper. Think about what that actually means. An ancestral population cut off from both Asia and the Americas simultaneously survived and adapted within this now vanished Ice Age landscape for thousands of years, developing distinct genetic characteristics during this long period of isolation, before their descendants ever set foot on either the North American or South American continents as we understand them today. This would help explain how humans could plausibly have reached as far south as New Mexico over 20,000 years ago, while genetic divergence between Native American populations and their Siberian relatives still points to a later, separate wave of migration as well. Because that is the next major discovery, and it may be the single most important insight the ancient DNA revolution has provided. There was not simply one migration into the Americas. There were several. Genetic research published over the past decade has identified at least 3 genetically distinct waves of migration into the Americas, each occurring at different times, and each contributing differently to the genetic makeup of indigenous peoples living across North and South America today. The first and earliest wave appears to be connected to those ancient Beringian populations, the very ancestors who eventually contributed to the deep genetic lineage confirmed within genomes like ANZIC1. Researchers sometimes refer to a distinct related population identified through this research as the ancient Beringians, based on the genome of an infant discovered at a site called Upward Sun River in Alaska, whose ancestry appears to have split off from other Native American lineages before their ancestors ever moved further south. A second, genetically distinct wave appears, connected to the ancestors of populations speaking what linguists call Na-Dene languages, a family of languages spoken by numerous indigenous peoples across Alaska, Western Canada, and notably including the Navajo and Apache peoples further south. Genetic evidence suggests this wave arrived somewhat later than the initial founding migration, carrying subtly distinct genetic markers that set these populations apart from earlier arrivals. A third and even later wave of migration appears connected to the ancestors of Arctic-dwelling peoples, including the Inuit and Yupik populations who live across the northernmost regions of North America today. This wave appears to have occurred considerably more recently, likely within just the past several thousand years, and shows genetic continuity with populations still living across the Bering Strait region in Siberia today. This means the story of how humans first arrived in the Americas was never a single, tidy migration event at all. It was a long, layered, repeated process unfolding across many thousands of years, with different populations arriving at different times, sometimes overlapping, sometimes remaining genetically distinct from one another for thousands of years afterward. This layered picture also helps resolve a question that puzzled researchers for years. If the interior of North America was still locked beneath massive ice sheets until roughly 13,000 years ago, how could people possibly have reached New Mexico, let alone southern Chile, thousands of years earlier than that? The genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly points to an answer that once seemed unlikely, but now appears far more probable. Rather than walking through a single narrow interior corridor between melting ice sheets, early populations likely moved south along the Pacific coastline itself, following a route, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. This coastal environment would have offered a remarkably consistent, reliable source of food year-round, including fish, shellfish, seaweed, and marine mammals, all accessible to people who understood how to work with the coastline rather than needing to wait for interior land routes to open. Genetic evidence from coastal indigenous communities in Places like the Channel Islands off the coast of California lends further support to this theory, showing continuous human presence along the Pacific coast dating back many thousands of years earlier than the old Clovis first model ever allowed for. If this coastal route theory is correct, it would mean early Americans possessed considerably more sophisticated maritime knowledge and boat-building skill at a considerably earlier date than researchers had previously assumed possible, further reinforcing just how capable and adaptable these ancient populations genuinely were. If discoveries like this genuinely fascinate you, take a moment to like this video right now. It helps this channel continue bringing you carefully researched deep dives exactly like this one. There's one more genetic discovery, however, that may be the single strangest and most debated finding to emerge from this entire body of research. In 2015, researchers analyzing genomes from indigenous populations in the Amazon region of Brazil discovered something nobody had anticipated. Certain genetic markers found among these Amazonian populations showed a surprising, statistically significant similarity to genetic markers found among indigenous peoples of Australia and New Guinea, populations located on the complete opposite side of the entire Pacific Ocean. Researchers have since nicknamed this mysterious genetic signal Population Y, taken from the word Wipiquera, meaning ancestor in the Tupi language, spoken by some of the Amazonian groups involved in this research. Nobody currently knows with certainty how, or exactly when, this genetic connection came to exist. Some researchers have proposed that a small, genetically distinct population, possibly related to early Australasian peoples, may have reached the Americas at some point independently, later mixing with other early Native American populations, before this genetic signal eventually became concentrated within certain isolated Amazonian communities over thousands of subsequent years. Other researchers remain considerably more cautious about this interpretation, suggesting that this apparent genetic connection could instead result from more complex, harder to model patterns of ancient population structure within the original founding populations themselves, rather than requiring an entirely separate, independent migration event. As with so much of this research, scientists studying this specific question continue to actively debate exactly what this genetic signal ultimately means, and further, research and additional ancient genomes will likely be required before this particular mystery is fully resolved one way or another. This kind of open, ongoing scientific disagreement is not a flaw in the process. It is precisely how legitimate science continues to function and refine itself over time. Genuine mysteries like Population Y remind us that even with all of modern genetic sequencing technology available, there remain deep, still unanswered questions about humanity's earliest chapters in the Americas. Now, it would be incomplete and frankly irresponsible to discuss ancient DNA research connected to indigenous American ancestry without addressing the complicated, often painful history surrounding this exact type of research. Because the story of ancient DNA in the Americas is not only a story of remarkable scientific discovery, it is also, unavoidably, a story about consent, respect, and the rights of indigenous communities over their own ancestors' remains. Perhaps no case illustrates this tension more clearly than that of Kennewick Man, a 9,000-year-old skeleton discovered along the banks of the Columbia River in Washington state back in 1996. Almost immediately after his discovery, a prolonged, deeply contentious legal battle erupted between scientific researchers eager to study his remains and several Native American tribes, including the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, who claimed him as a direct ancestor and requested his immediate, respectful reburial according to tribal customs and beliefs. For nearly 2 decades, this case moved slowly and painfully through the American legal system, as scientists and tribal representatives repeatedly clashed over who held the rightful authority to determine what should happen to these ancient remains. Then, in 2015, ancient DNA analysis finally provided a scientifically definitive answer. Kennewick Man's genome showed clear, unambiguous genetic continuity with contemporary Native American populations, confirming what the tribes involved had insisted all along. He was, in fact, a direct ancestor. Following this genetic confirmation, his remains were finally repatriated and respectfully reburied by tribal representatives in 2017, more than 2 full decades after his initial discovery. This case, along with many others like it across the Americas, has fundamentally reshaped how modern researchers approach ancient DNA research involving indigenous remains. Today, many leading geneticists studying this exact topic now work directly and collaboratively with indigenous communities, seeking informed consent before conducting genetic research, and often involving tribal representatives directly throughout the entire research process, rather than simply extracting samples and publishing results without any meaningful community involvement or consultation whatsoever. This shift matters enormously, and for good reason. For much of the 20th century, scientific institutions frequently treated indigenous remains as little more than research specimens, collected, studied, and stored often for many decades without any meaningful consent from surviving descendant communities. The passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in the United States back in 1990 marked an important legal turning point, formally requiring museums and federally funded institutions to work toward returning human remains and culturally significant artifacts to their rightful indigenous communities. Understanding this full context transforms how we should genuinely think about ancient DNA research more broadly. This is not simply a story about scientists rewriting history in some abstract, purely academic sense. It is a story about real communities with living descendants today, whose ancestors' remains and genetic legacies deserve to be treated with the same dignity, respect, and consent that any of us would want extended to our own family members. So where does all of this leave us regarding the actual timeline of how humans first arrived in the Americas? Based on the current weight of genetic and archaeological evidence combined, most researchers now believe ancestral populations connected to Native Americans likely became isolated within Beringia sometime between 25,000 and 30,000 years ago. Some portion of this population likely began moving into the Americas by at least 23,000 years ago, based directly on the white sands footprint evidence, quite possibly following ice-free coastal routes along the Pacific shoreline, rather than waiting for interior ice sheets to eventually melt and open an inland passage southward. Additional, genetically distinct waves of migration continued arriving over the following many thousands of years, ultimately contributing to the rich, complex genetic tapestry of indigenous peoples found across both continents today. If you find these deep genetic threads connecting all of humanity together as fascinating as I do, consider subscribing. Because there are many more carefully researched stories just like this one still waiting to be explored, there is something genuinely humbling about sitting with this information carefully. For most of the 20th century, we told ourselves a simple, tidy story about how the Americas came to be populated, largely because that was the best available evidence at the time, and because tidy stories are naturally easier to teach, easier to remember, and easier to accept without lingering discomfort. But ancient DNA, quite literally the genetic material passed down directly through countless generations, has shown us that the true story was always more layered, more ancient, and considerably more remarkable than that simpler narrative ever allowed for. It reminds us that scientific consensus, however confidently stated at any given moment in history, remains a work in progress, rather than a finished conclusion. New evidence, whether preserved in ancient footprints, ancient bones, or ancient strands of DNA, will continue to refine and reshape our understanding of humanity's deepest history for as long as researchers continue asking careful, honest questions, and for as long as indigenous communities themselves remain genuinely included as full partners in that ongoing search for answers. Somewhere beneath the frozen tundra of ancient Beringia, and within fossilized footprints still preserved in the New Mexico desert, and coiled quietly within the DNA of millions of indigenous people living across the Americas today, lies one of the most remarkable migration stories in the entire human journey. Scientists were wrong about exactly how it happened, and thanks to the patient, careful work of ancient DNA research, conducted with growing respect for the very communities this history belongs to, we are only now finally beginning to understand it correctly.